My name is Madeline Brooks. I'm 41 years old and I've lived a quiet life in the shadows. You're here early trying to be seen for once. That was the first thing my sister said to me in front of the whole room. I didn't answer. I just smiled the way I always do when Tessa turns a family moment into a performance. We were standing inside the banquet hall at Westford Veterans Center. Warm light spilled from overhead chandeliers. Brass-trimmed portraits of war heroes lined the walls. The air smelled of polished wood roast beef and faint anxiety. A military jazz trio played softly in the corner while waiters in white coats circled with drinks. It was Eli's commissioning celebration, Tessa's son, her golden boy, the one we were all supposedly here for. But she made sure as always that it circled back to her. "Everyone, this is my sister Maddie," she announced, gesturing with a wine glass as she turned to a circle of officers and their families. "She's our quiet one. Always has been. Never married, never had kids, but she tilted her head with faux sympathy. She works hard at something." "Right." Maddie laughter rose, cautious and tight. I didn't speak. I never do when she goes on like that. You learn over time to master silence like a weapon. My fingers tightened around the stem of my glass. She wasn't done. "Well, Maddie always did like to watch life from the sidelines," she said, smiling sweetly before taking a long sip of Chardonnay. Nothing wrong with that, of course. There it was, the gut punch. I felt it in my spine before it even reached my stomach. That familiar pang, not from what she said, but the eyes that flicked toward me, measuring, dismissing, forgetting. It wasn't the first time she'd done it, but tonight, with Eli in uniform, flanked by his commanding officer and a dozen others, it landed like a slap. I turned away from the group, pretending to examine a painting on the far wall. It was a WWW2 portrait of a woman in uniform saluting in front of a B-17 bomber. I stood in front of it, not really seeing it, just breathing. You think you're prepared for these moments. You think it won't sting. But something inside me folded sharp and sudden. For a second, I thought about walking out. Instead, I took a slow breath and adjusted the edge of my blazer, careful to make sure the cuff stayed in place. No one here needed to see what was hidden beneath. I've worn long sleeves my entire adult life, even in summer. Most people assumed it was modesty or habit. In reality, it was protocol. Conceal all identifying marks. No exceptions. "Maddie," a voice said behind me. It wasn't Tessa this time. I turned. Eli was walking toward me, his dress blues crisp and perfect, his posture rigid, proud, his hair cut to the grain, his face calm but curious. He'd only just arrived, still surrounded by congratulatory voices. But he had stepped away, walked across the room to find me. He gave me a tight smile. "You okay?" I nodded. "Always." He leaned in, voice low. "She shouldn't have said that." I raised an eyebrow. "She's not wrong. I've never been much for crowds." "Still," he said, then paused. "I've been meaning to ask you something. About a patch I saw, once, in an old photo in Grandma's attic. It had a black hawk and a red ring." I felt my breath catch. "That emblem was scrubbed from official existence in 2012. You sure?" I asked, voice low. He nodded. "I remember it because it looked different. And when I searched it, I couldn't find anything. Not even on Defense Archives. That's not normal." I said nothing. He looked at me differently now. Slowly, like he was piecing together a puzzle that had been on the table for years. "I know you've never talked about what you did," he continued, "but was it field work?" Before I could answer, a sudden cheer rose from the center of the room. Someone clinked a glass. Tessa waved us over like royalty. Her voice was already rising again. "Let's give a round of applause for our future Top Gun." I touched Eli's arm lightly. "Go enjoy your party." He hesitated. "I'll come back. Don't leave, okay?" I gave a soft smile. I won't leave. But I was lying. I turned toward the back hallway near the coat racks and slipped out through the side door. The night was cool. Crickets chirped in the grass. I stood under the yellow porch light, hands buried in my coat pockets, the soft hum of music bleeding through the brick walls behind me. This was supposed to be Eli's night. He deserved it. And yet, even here, she had made it about her. Her jabs, her showmanship, her need to remind everyone that I was small while she was the one who had raised a real hero. I'd spent 2 decades in the most classified intelligence division the Navy had ever assembled. I had operated in 6 continents, walked through civil wars in civilian clothes, and neutralized targets who didn't officially exist. I had 4 commendations that weren't even named on record, and I had the scars to prove it. But none of it counted in Tessa's world. Not unless it looked good in a frame on the mantel. I stared out across the parking lot. Maybe it was finally time to stop pretending that silence was the only armor I had left. The door behind me creaked open. Eli stepped out. Alone. I turned, startled. He looked directly at me and then did something I will never forget. He stood straight, raised his right hand to his brow, and saluted. "Ma'am." The door behind him swung wide. Everyone inside fell quiet, and just like that, the room began to turn. I should have known Eli would be the one to see me. Even as a little boy, he was sharp in a way Tessa never gave him credit for. Quiet, watchful, the kind of child who noticed everything but rarely said a word. I remember once when he was 5, I found him sitting in my old bedroom at Mom's house, carefully leafing through a torn-up travel atlas I kept from my deployment years. He pointed to a red circle I had drawn over somewhere in Syria and asked, "Why did you mark this?" No one else ever noticed those circles. I told him it was just a place I visited. It was never just a visit. But I didn't lie because I wanted to. I lied because I had to. Tessa never understood that. She still doesn't. We grew up in Fairford, Pennsylvania, a sleepy American town where everyone knew your middle name, your GPA, and who you kissed behind the bleachers. Tessa was the star from the start, varsity cheer captain, homecoming queen, the kind of girl who never asked permission to speak. I was her shadow, 2 years older, but always the one walking behind. I didn't envy her, but I did notice how easily the world opened for her, how every room seemed to warm when she entered. She never had to work for attention. She just existed in it. I was the one with nosebleeds from late-night cram sessions and bruises on my shins from track practice. I got accepted into Georgetown with a partial scholarship and a letter from my ROTC supervisor. Tessa barely finished junior year before getting engaged to a realtor's son with a 3-car garage and a backyard pool. Mom said Tessa was making a smart choice while she looked at me like I was headed to exile. I left home at 19, signed the dotted line, raised my hand, and then I disappeared. That's not poetic. That's literal. The division I entered doesn't have a website. No public insignia, no list of names on any public wall. We don't talk about what we do not to families, not to each other. Sometimes we go months without names, just code names, missions, coordinates. My career was a series of flights that didn't exist and reports I never wrote. When Mom died 10 years ago, I came back for the funeral. That was the last time Tessa and I were in the same room for longer than 10 minutes. She made some joke at the wake Maddie's probably working for the CIA, or maybe she just sells boring office supplies and pretends she's important. Everyone laughed. I smiled and stayed quiet. What would I even say? Actually, I've survived 2 embassy bombings, blackmailed a dictator, and carried a wounded translator through 5 miles of desert while being hunted by paramilitary. No one wants to hear that at a wake. So, I let her story become the only one the family told. I was the odd aunt, the single woman with no roots, no kids, no husband, no clear job title. Tessa filled in the blanks for them, and I let her. For a while, I thought maybe that was the price of safety. But Eli saw through it. He started asking more questions after his 3rd year at the academy. Nothing direct, just small things. What's the fastest you've ever driven? Have you ever been to Tel Aviv? Why don't you use social media? Each time I'd give him half a smile and change the subject. But his eyes narrowed a little more every time. I wanted to tell him. God, I wanted to. But part of me was afraid. Not for his safety, he was smart and cautious, but for mine. Because admitting the truth out loud would mean cracking the shell I'd built around myself. Once you start telling your story, it stops being yours. It belongs to the people who hear it, who judge it, twist it. Tessa would have torn it apart. She never let me live in peace, not even when I visited quietly and left without fanfare. Every chance she got, she reminded the room that I was between jobs or still figuring things out or always traveling, but we never really know why. I'd let it roll off me. Until it didn't. Until last night, when she smirked and said, she always liked to watch life from the sidelines, and Eli heard it, really heard it. When he stepped outside and saluted me, something cracked in the air, not just for me, but for everyone watching. Tessa's expression when he raised his hand. I'll never forget it. A mix of confusion, disbelief, and a flicker of something she never shows me. Fear. But it wasn't the salute that made her uneasy. It was the way Eli looked at me like he saw someone she never could, like he knew. He called me ma'am in full uniform. That wasn't for show. That was protocol. And he didn't do it for me. He did it for them to show them what they missed. I nodded once and walked back inside, my heart pounding against the silence. Everyone stared as Eli followed a step behind me, proud and calm. When Tessa tried to speak, I brushed past her and walked to the far end of the hall where a table was set with medals, photos, and memorabilia from graduating cadets. One of the officers, an older man with a silver star on his lapel, stepped forward and extended a hand. "Lieutenant Commander Brooks," he said quietly. "It's an honor." Tessa froze behind me. I didn't look at her. I just nodded again calmly, as if this wasn't the first time someone had used that name. Because it wasn't. And for the first time in years, I stopped pretending to be someone small. You'd think the moment someone calls you Lieutenant Commander in front of your entire family would shift the atmosphere forever, but in mine, it only made the silence louder. After that night, no one really knew what to say. I didn't stick around long, just long enough to congratulate Eli again and thank the officers who had shown me a rare, quiet respect. I caught their curious glances. They were trained men, discreet by default, but a few clearly recognized the name. One even nodded at my left wrist. Didn't think anyone wore that mark outside of Langley. I said nothing, just like always. Tessa didn't speak to me the rest of the night. I'd brushed past her once at the dessert table, and she gave me a sharp smile, but her eyes were flaring. That look, tight lips, clenched jaw like she was forcing herself not to explode, was one I hadn't seen since high school. She couldn't control the narrative anymore. And she hated that. 3 days later, she sent me a text. "Whatever game you're playing, Maddie, I suggest you stop before people start asking real questions. No greeting. No thank you for coming. No acknowledgement of the moment that shifted our entire family's perception." I stared at the message for 10 minutes before deleting it. Tessa's always been that way. Growing up, she was the kind of girl who made people pick sides in imaginary wars. Me or her. Right or wrong. Pretty or smart. And she always framed herself as the one to rescue you from your own dullness if only you stayed in your place. I didn't want to be part of her game anymore, but that didn't mean I was done fighting. 2 weeks after the banquet, I got an invitation to Eli's formal Air Wing pinning ceremony on base. It was smaller, more private, reserved for family and commanding staff. Eli included me by name on the security list. When I RSVP'd yes, I got a follow-up email the next morning, not from Eli, but from Tessa. A forwarded message, no subject line. Just her words. "We both know you're not really family." That one hit. Not because I believed her, but because it reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten. My whole life, Tessa made sure I was left out. I was left off yearbooks, party invites, even my own father's obituary. She rewrote the draft before it was printed and called me a devoted friend of the family instead of his daughter. I didn't argue. I just cut the page out and burned it in the sink. But now I wasn't 19. I wasn't afraid of her anymore. Still, it hurt. More than I expected. Because the deeper truth was, despite everything I used to want to be close to her. For years, I hoped she'd soften. That once we were older, she'd drop the rivalry and we could finally exist side by side. Sisters. That illusion died the night she smirked at me under the chandelier and reminded the room I'd never made much of a life. A week later, I drove 6 hours back to the base for Eli's ceremony. When I stepped onto the tarmac, I saw him standing there, clean-cut back, straight eyes forward. His commanding officer stood beside him. A small crowd had gathered. I could see families' proud mothers clutching Kleenex little brothers climbing on folding chairs. Tessa was there, too. Of course she was. She wore a cream blazer and expensive sunglasses, the kind of outfit people wear when they want to be photographed. She stood in the front row, beaming as if she'd raised him all alone. When she spotted me, her mouth twitched. I saw her lean in to whisper something to a woman beside her who turned and looked me over unimpressed. I walked to the far end of the row and stood alone. I didn't need to be seen. I was there for Eli. But even there, even in uniformed company, I could feel her energy pressing in on me, defensive, performative, tense. I could almost hear her calculating how to reclaim the spotlight, how to turn my presence into a footnote. She didn't get the chance. When the time came for the symbolic pinning, Eli stood tall, pulled off his white cap, and reached into his pocket. Instead of stepping toward his mother, he walked the full length of the line toward me. I froze. Everyone turned. Tessa's mouth parted slightly. Her hand instinctively reached out like she'd been expecting to do the honors. Eli stopped in front of me. "I want you to do it," he said. His voice was calm but firm. "You're the reason I became who I am." My heart thudded so loudly I was sure the whole field could hear it. "I'm not sure I should," I began. He looked me square in the eye. "You don't need to be sure." "I am." He extended the golden pin. My hands trembled as I stepped forward, attached the wing insignia to his uniform, and fastened the clasp with a steady click. The applause came slowly unsure at first. Then it rose, genuine, warm, and loud. Eli smiled and leaned in. "They don't need to know everything," he whispered, "but I do." I didn't cry. I don't cry in public, but something shifted inside me. Something I had locked away for too long. Pride. Not for myself, but for the legacy I never thought anyone would carry forward. After the ceremony, Tessa didn't speak to me. She left early, citing a headache. I watched her drive away from the base in her pristine SUV, speeding off like the truth was chasing her. Eli found me at the edge of the hangar. He handed me something, a folded envelope. "I requested it from Naval Archives," he said. "Had to go through a few people." Inside was a scanned, redacted dossier. My name was on the top. No missions, no details. Just 3 words. Operational Clearance Ghost. I laughed. For the first time in years, it didn't sound bitter. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for days. I kept walking past it, doing laundry, wiping down the counters, refilling the coffee tin, pretending like it wasn't there. But every time I glanced over, the word ghost stared back at me like a quiet accusation. I'd lived like one for too long. I thought after that ceremony, after Eli's salute, the pinning, the stunned silence from Tessa, I'd feel a sense of peace. But instead, I felt hollow. The kind of hollow you don't talk about. The kind that seeps into your bones when the phone doesn't ring and no one checks in, and even after you've been publicly seen, really seen for the first time in years, you still go home alone. I sat in my kitchen on the 3rd night after the base event, eating cold chicken and staring out the window. The house creaked in its usual way. A fan turned lazily overhead. Somewhere outside, a neighborhood dog barked at nothing. The silence was familiar, almost comforting. But that night, it felt like a verdict. I opened the envelope again. Eli had included a post-it note on the inside. "You don't have to stay invisible anymore." It should have made me smile. Instead, it made me feel like a fraud. I'd chosen this life. Chosen the silence, the isolation, the cold professionalism. I'd traded birthdays and holidays and family cookouts for intel briefings, encrypted comms, and hotel rooms with bulletproof windows. I didn't regret my service, but sometimes in the quiet, I wondered if I'd made a mistake by staying gone for so long, if I'd ever meant to come back at all. The next day, I got a phone call. It wasn't from Eli, it was from Tessa. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail. Just 3 clipped sentences. "I don't know what game you and Eli are playing, but you've crossed a line. I won't let you turn my son against me." No apology. No acknowledgement. Just fury polished into passive aggression like she always did. I deleted it without listening twice. But the ache in my chest didn't go away. Later that week, I went to visit our mother's grave. It was a small, neatly kept plot at St. Mary's just outside town. No flowers. Just a flat marker with her name and 2 dates. No quote, no sentiment. Tessa had picked the stone. I stood there for a while, not really knowing why I'd come. I hadn't visited in years. Maybe I wanted something guidance closure, a ghost of my own. I wasn't sure. The wind rustled the trees gently. The sun was sharp but low, casting long shadows across the lawn. I knelt down and whispered, I didn't want it to be like this. And for a moment, I let myself feel all of it, the years I missed, the birthdays, never celebrated the father I buried while wearing a civilian dress, because the Navy said I couldn't wear my uniform to a non-combat funeral. The friendships I let fade for security clearances and duty rotations, the sense that I had lived 100 lives and still didn't belong in any of them. The hardest part, Tessa would never understand what I gave up, and she'd never say thank you. That night, I got a message from Eli, a photo. It was of his locker. Taped inside was a scanned copy of that same redacted clearance page with my name on it and a note written beneath in permanent marker. She didn't need medals. She was the mission. My throat caught, but even that, his pride, his loyalty, couldn't cover the low I'd hit. Because I realized something brutal in that moment. Even when someone finally sees you, it doesn't undo the years of being invisible. Even when the truth rises, it doesn't fill the silence that shaped you. I woke up the next morning to rain. It felt fitting. I sat at my desk, pulled open an old locked drawer, and retrieved a leather-bound notebook, one I hadn't touched since my last active tour. Inside were pages of names, places, reflections, the things I was never allowed to say out loud. I flipped to the back. There, taped into the final page, was a picture. It was from Kandahar. Me, in civilian clothes, sitting on a cracked concrete wall, flanked by 2 women and a child I helped smuggle across a checkpoint after their family was targeted. I wasn't smiling. None of us were. But we were alive. And for the first time in months, I started to write again. Not for Tessa, not for the Navy. For myself. I wrote about the people whose names were erased. I wrote about the missions that never made the news. I wrote about the nights in hotel rooms in Prague and Rabat and Mogadishu when I lay awake wondering if I'd ever see home again. I wrote about the time I disarmed a man twice my size using only a fountain pen and a linen napkin. I wrote about the guilt, the silence, the weight of the things I couldn't say even now. And at the bottom of the page I wrote, I thought I disappeared to protect the people I loved. Maybe I just disappeared because I didn't believe they'd love me if they knew. I closed the journal and breathed in deeply. That was my lowest point. Not the humiliation, not the rejection, not even the years alone. The lowest point was realizing that after everything, I still let her voice shape how I saw myself. It was time to change that. The thing about being trained in intelligence work is you're always calculating. You see patterns where others see coincidences. You hear subtext in silences. You don't forget. You file. You study. And when the time comes, you move. Not with noise, but precision. Tessa was loud. I had always been precise. And now, for the first time, I wasn't on assignment for a nation. I was on assignment for myself. The morning after I finished writing in that old field journal, I sat on my porch with a mug of black coffee and reread the last few entries. Pages of memories that had never been voiced. A quiet record of a life that was never supposed to be known. I thought about burning them, but something inside me stopped. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I wrote a letter. Not an email, not a text. A real letter. It wasn't for Tessa. Not exactly. It was addressed to Eli, and it began like this. You once asked me if I regretted anything. I never answered. The truth is yes. I regret staying quiet for so long that people like your mother were allowed to rewrite who I was. I told him pieces of the truth. Enough to know me. Enough to understand the choices. I didn't glorify anything. I didn't need to. I simply laid out what silence had cost. At the bottom of the page, I added a request. Share this with anyone who needs to know why you stood up for me. That was it. No explanations. No vengeance. Just truth. I sealed the envelope and dropped it off at the base mailroom myself. Then I drove home and deleted Tessa's number from my phone. That night, I slept without waking for the first time in months. A week passed, then another. I didn't expect anything. But something was shifting. The first shift came from a woman I barely knew, one of Eli's commanding officer's wives. She found my address through the base registry and sent me a handwritten card. Inside was a photo of her daughter just commissioned standing next to Eli. She wrote, "He speaks of you like a legend. Thank you for reminding us there's a strength quieter than metals." The second shift came from my father's old friend Ray. I hadn't seen him since I was a teenager. He left a voicemail on my landline after someone passed him my letter. "I served in Nam Madi. You did more with a briefcase than I ever did with a rifle. If your father were here, he'd be proud as hell." I didn't cry. Not yet. But something loosened inside me. Still, the third shift caught me off guard. It was Tessa. She showed up, not at my house, at my office. The place I still worked part-time consulting defense systems under a civilian title but still cleared for sensitive materials. She wore sunglasses again like she always did when she was nervous. Her arms crossed her mouth tight. I let her into the lobby but didn't invite her beyond security. She stood by the double doors blinking at the badge scanner. "This is where you work?" she asked, trying to sound casual. I said nothing. I read the letter she added. Eli forwarded it. "With your permission, I assume." I nodded. She looked away, then back. "I didn't know she said quiet for once." I crossed my arms. "You never asked. I thought you just didn't want us in your life." I stared at her. "You made sure I felt like I didn't belong in it." She winced. "I'm not going to apologize," she said. Of course she wouldn't. "But I am going to say this," she continued, voice lower now. "Whatever you did, however big it was, you didn't do it alone. You had choices. You could have come back. You didn't have to disappear." I looked at her level. "I disappeared," I said, "because being near you felt worse." That landed. She shifted her weight, then reached into her purse and handed me something. A photo, old folded. Us, kids, on the swings behind the church playground, me pushing her laughing. "I used to look at this and think you just stopped caring," she whispered. "Now I wonder if I just made it too hard for you to come back." I didn't respond. Not with words, but I didn't throw the photo away either. She left without asking for forgiveness. I didn't offer it. That wasn't the point. The point was I didn't need her permission anymore. She had finally seen me, or at least enough of me to stop rewriting the story. That night, I opened the envelope Eli gave me again, the one with the redacted dossier, and I added one more note. "I gave everything, and I survived. That's enough." Then I pulled out a clean sheet of paper, and I started writing a new letter. This one wasn't for Eli. It wasn't for Tessa. It was for me. Because for the first time in years, I realized something I should have known all along. I was never invisible. I was just too powerful to fit inside their story. So I stopped trying to. 2 months later, I was standing in front of a classroom full of cadets at a private leadership seminar on base. Eli had invited me not as family, but as a guest speaker. "Leadership in Silence" was the title of the session. Fitting, I thought. I wore a tailored black suit that day. No ribbons, no visible insignia, just a thin silver pin tucked near the lapel, small, unassuming, but specific. The kind of symbol that only the right people would recognize. The kind of symbol that meant she's not just here to talk. The room was full of eager young officers. Not just wide-eyed and ambitious, but smart, the kind who would lead drone teams sit across from diplomats monitor satellites. The kind I used to train from a screen halfway across the world. Eli introduced me without mentioning our connection, just my name. A short line about unlisted operations, and then he stepped aside. I could feel the questions in their eyes. I stepped up, and I told them the truth, not about missions or medals, but about weight, about what it means to carry power you can't name, about the burden of never being seen and the cost of not asking to be. I ended with this: "Not all strength is loud, and not all heroes will ever be clapped for. But some of us sleep better knowing we did the right thing in silence even when the room tried to erase us." When I stepped down, the silence in the room was full, not stunned honoring. As I walked past Eli on my way out, he gave me the smallest nod. That was all I needed. That evening, I was supposed to leave base and head back to my house, but Eli caught me in the parking lot. "Come by the hangar," he said. "There's someone I want you to meet." I followed him to the far end of the grounds toward the rows of fighter jets sleeping under twilight. The hangar doors were open. Inside, a few pilots were gathered relaxed, laughing. When we entered, they stood straighter. A couple of them stepped aside as we walked in, and then I saw him, Colonel Marcus Layton, a name I hadn't heard in over 15 years. He'd been a major when I last saw him, an embedded field analyst during Operation Shadow Reef. I'd fed him intel-coordinated covert ops through the city's underground networks. We'd only spoken in code then, never saw each other face to face. But the moment our eyes met across the hangar, I knew he recognized me. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He stepped forward and saluted. "Lieutenant Commander Brooks," he said. "I never thought I'd get to thank you in person." I returned the salute slowly. "I wasn't supposed to be seen," I said quietly. "That's what made you the best of us." Around us, the room held its breath, and just behind me I heard a sharp intake of breath like someone choking on surprise. I turned. Tessa. I don't know how long she'd been there or why she came, but her face said everything. Eli must have invited her, or maybe she followed out of suspicion. Either way, she stood there in the doorway, arms stiff at her sides, mouth, parted eyes darting between me and the colonel like the whole foundation she'd built had started to crack. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But I didn't flinch. I turned back to the colonel. "Colonel Layton, meet my sister Tessa." He extended a hand. "Pleasure." She took it but barely. "She's family," I added, though I suspect she never imagined she'd be shaking hands with someone who once read my seat reps. Tessa forced a laugh. "Well, life's full of surprises." Eli stepped up beside her. "You came," he said softly. She nodded. "I wanted to see for myself." I watched her face. For the first time, it didn't hold resentment or bitterness, just confusion. She looked at me like someone seeing a building they'd lived beside for years only to find out it was a monument, and I realized something. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about being seen. It was about reclaiming the parts of me I had given away in order to make other people comfortable. And now they would have to make peace with me, not the story they invented, not the version they preferred. Me. Before we left the hangar, Eli reached into his flight suit and handed me a small item wrapped in cloth. I unfolded it. A silver pin. The same one I had used to pin him at the ceremony, but this one was different. Etched with 2 initials, MB. He smiled. I had it made, not standard issue, but some of us wanted you to have it. I looked up. He was standing beside 2 other officers, now both young women. One had a scar along her cheek. The other held her head high with a quiet steel gaze I knew well. They nodded, and in perfect unison, all 3 of them saluted me. No one else in that hangar moved. The only sound was the American flag overhead, snapping softly in the wind. I stood straighter than I had in years, not because I had something to prove, but because I finally remembered who I was. There's a strange moment that comes after you've been truly seen for the first time in years. It's not loud or triumphant like in the movies. It's quiet, like the air shifts around you, and for once you don't need to defend your space in the room. You simply exist in it, fully, completely, without shame. That's how it felt the next morning when I woke up and looked at myself in the mirror of the on-base lodging. My eyes were tired, yes, but the heaviness that had clung to my shoulders for years was gone. Not erased, just no longer mine to carry. I dressed simply jeans, a white blouse, boots polished but worn. I clipped the silver pin Eli gave me to the inside of my bag, not on display, just close enough to remind me. I didn't need anyone to see it to know who I was. The drive home was long but calm. I kept the windows down, let the wind braid through my hair, and when I pulled into my quiet little street back in Oregon, there was a message waiting. From Tessa. "I don't know who you really are, Morgan, but I'm starting to understand why you never needed the spotlight. I think I'm sorry. I stared at the text for a long time. Then I put the phone down. Not because I didn't appreciate it, but because I wasn't looking for an apology anymore. I had outgrown that need. Some debts aren't owed to us by others, they're owed by us to ourselves. I walked into my house, fed the cat, made some coffee, and then sat down at the old oak desk where I used to read classified briefs by flashlight back when I was working remotely. I opened a blank document and started writing. Not a memoir, not a confession, just a story. My story. For years, I believed silence was my armor, that disappearing was the only way to protect what mattered, but silence left unchecked becomes something else entirely. It becomes erasure, and I'm not disappearing anymore. In the weeks that followed, I began to connect the dots of my own timeline again, not through awards or reports, but through the people I'd impacted. The cadets I trained from afar, the humanitarian who told me my logistics reroute saved 40 civilians, the young lieutenant who emailed to say her promotion path was modeled on the encrypted recordings I once narrated. Even the Pentagon had finally declassified one of the operations I'd led years late, of course, but there it was, my code name printed in the footnotes, a line of history no one could rewrite now. I didn't need parades, I didn't need headlines, but I did need to reclaim my name. The name that once sat quietly in a locked drawer. The name I almost let disappear. Morgan Brooks, 38 years old, former lieutenant commander, cyber intelligence specialist, instructor, quiet strategist, and now mentor. In late spring, Eli invited me back for a second lecture, but this time he didn't introduce me. I walked in alone, greeted the cadets with a nod, and opened with one line. "You've heard of me, you just didn't know it." They laughed, but respectfully. They knew. I finished my talk with a small ritual I'd seen another officer do once in silence. I placed a sealed envelope on the front desk, a single phrase handwritten on it for the one who never speaks up. Then I left the room without explaining it. A few weeks later, I received a photo from one of the cadets. The envelope was now pinned to a corkboard in their dorm common area. Next to it, someone had written, "She didn't ask for a voice. She became the voice." And under it, someone else had scribbled in blue ink, Lynette CMDR Brooks, the invisible shield. I sat at my kitchen table, coffee in hand, sunlight falling in slow stripes across the floor. I thought of Dad, of how he never really saw me for who I was, always so focused on Tessa's charm and polish. I thought of Mom's silence at dinners, never challenging the pecking order we all obeyed. And I thought of young Eli, eyes bright with respect because he hadn't saluted me out of duty. He saluted because he knew. He knew I'd carried a war no one saw, fought battles that never made the news. And I did it without asking for applause. That's the thing about quiet power. It doesn't need to announce itself. But when it finally steps forward, it changes the room forever. So now I live in a small home with bookshelves full of classified memoirs, a garden that never listens to orders, and a cat who thinks she owns the house. And sometimes, just sometimes, I visit that old hangar on base when no one's there. I walk past the planes, past the locker rooms, past the echo of boots and barked orders, and I stop in front of a small brass plaque they added near the back. No date, no full name. Just a phrase etched in steel, "They never saw her coming," and every time I read it, I smile, because now they always will.